I've noticed we've talked about a lot of games recently that have been taking a long time to come out. Little Devil Inside, Gollum, we look back at Quantum Break, which had a good handful of delays in the mid-2010s, and then generally outside of this channel, Midnight Suns got delayed again, Beyond Good and Evil is planted firmly in development hell, and Hogwarts Legacy got moved to February. This type of news is inescapable. To me, one of the most fascinating disappearing acts in recent memory though is The Last Night, mainly for the reason that while it looks from the outside to have completely fallen off the face of the earth since its exciting 2017 reveal trailer, it actually has one of the more active fan bases and vocal creators I've seen for an unreleased new IP, and there's a lot more on the game out there than you might think. The Last Night started out as a game jam in 2014 when brothers Tim and Adrian Soret? I'm just realizing that I've only ever read it and haven't heard it. I'm pretty sure they're French, so I think it's Soret. I'm just gonna go with that. Tim and Adrian Soret decided to make a small entry into the competition inspired by both Flashback and apparently this still from The Matrix. Tim has a whole thread about the beginnings of The Last Night, which I'll link to below for anyone who's interested. It goes through the general process of completing that game jam, but ultimately where we get to is that The Last Night won overall best game and had the best visual rating out of all 265 games submitted, and it turned into a runaway train from there. The two brothers scrapped the dark fantasy game they began work on and decided to flesh out The Last Night into a much bigger product. They scattered around for extra talent and founded their own studio, Odd Tales, although creating the game proved to be a much longer process than they were expecting, initially gunning for a 2016 release only to be a ways off from launch all the way in 2022, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. 2016 also spelled Adrian's exit to pursue his own career, but 2017 would go down as the most important year for the game by a long shot, with Raw Fury announcing they would be publishing the title with a little teaser trailer and a full trailer appearing later in the year, which caught an even bigger wave of attention. People were beyond impressed with the incredible lighting effects, atmosphere, and detailed pixel art that the game had, which helped create this incredible 2.5D cyberpunk dystopian aesthetic, strengthened further by the sinister premise, and this minute and 20-second trailer that seemingly featured no raw gameplay had shot The Last Night into the stratosphere. But with that success also came controversy, as people were quick to point out Tim's pro-Gamergate stance back in 2014. This issue is brought up a lot when the game is mentioned. Any article, positive or negative, will bring this up, and if you're somebody who's well versed in the Last Night lore, I'm sure these mentions of the controversy feel redundant, but it is incredibly important to get an understanding of where the game's at today, how it got there, and how people view it, so I think it's absolutely worth mentioning, or really more than mentioning. I want to be able to cover as much of this as fairly as possible. Gamergate is a big, confusing pile of garbage that is way too complex for me to fully get into in this video. Believe me, I tried, and this script became a 15-minute Gamergate video in the middle of a 5-minute The Last Night video, but essentially how Gamergate is seen, what it always partially was, and how it ultimately definitely became, was a harassment campaign originally against a few specific people, but eventually just against women and people of color in gaming in general. Real or fake, characters, journalists, creative directors, everything. Pro-Gamergate sort of feels synonymous with pro-bigotry, but it's also widely accepted that the movement was very confusing, scattered, and out of control, especially early on, which meant that some people were actually trying to make different points and got clumped in with a hate train, so while hearing somebody was once pro-Gamergate is something that makes most people recoil, the sheer insanity of that situation I think grants a little bit of leeway to that crowd depending on what they actually said and when they distanced themselves from it. In Tim's case, this is what he said, using the Gamergate hashtag and talking about how he was against feminism. This was pretty clear cut for some people, and on some forums, any mentions of the game are responded to with people calling Tim a scumbag for his comments, and I can't say I blame them all that much for that. This looks pretty bad all things considered. It's also important to note that The Last Night had been pitched as a game about a second-class citizen with a gamified existence, and Tim's comments around E3 2017 where the game was shown off made it clear that it wouldn't shy away from political issues like universal basic income, so the concern wasn't just that supporting the game would mean supporting somebody that had in the past associated with a harassment campaign, which is bad in and of itself, but also the game itself might be a glorified way of sending that same message. If that's a conclusion that you came to, I think that's fair. It certainly doesn't help that if you look at descriptions of the game, it mentions how some of the themes will be the problems that may arise with UBI, and that you'll be pushing back against a society that wants you to conform. I mean, with that description, the trailer might as well have said, "In a world where everyone's a socialist pig, it's up to one man to achieve free thought and rise up against a progressive system. Fuck social justice warrior, The Last Night." But I also think just leaving it at that is a bit unfair. The first thing that's important to mention is that, like I said at the top of this section, Gamergate was pretty confusing when it was happening, and at one point a group of individuals was trying to make it about journalistic integrity. We can argue over whether those people were kidding themselves or misguided in who they allied with, or secretly trying to Trojan horse their worst beliefs into the mix, but I think for a period of time, people could definitely have confused Gamergate for different causes. And that's what one of Tim Soret's tweets claimed, and what he later said was part of the movement that he agreed agreed with before he distanced himself once it became more radicalized. In a Vice interview that occurred as the controversy was unfolding, he also tried to clear up his statements about feminism, saying that he unequivocally agreed with feminism as it was defined, and the tweet was simply sloppily worded, criticizing what feminism had turned into rather than what it should be, which is egalitarianism, which he agrees with. It's kind of funny to me because it feels like he's focusing on the radical side of the movement and using it to disagree with it, while also being part of a movement with a notoriously radical side, and in conclusion, time is a circle, nothing is real, and my head hurts. Now, is it possible that these tweets were a result of naivete and misunderstanding? I honestly think there's a chance it might be. From everything I can find, Tim's stance seems more like somebody who's misinformed than somebody who's trying to be hateful. Aside from this later addition to the Vice article where it's mentioned that he did contribute to spreading lies about a victim of Gamergate, but there's no source and I couldn't find the tweet in question, which makes me unsure if he made something up, retweeted something, was aware or not that it was a lie, anything. Not trying to defend it, it's just hard to make a judgment on it because I don't actually know what it's referring to. One thing that I think definitely helps is that he very publicly and very immediately renounced these tweets, said he regretted using the Gamergate hashtag, and acknowledged that his words came from a place of ignorance. Publisher pressure and seeing his creation get dragged through the mud may have been responsible for this immediate apology and retraction, but to his credit, he didn't tiptoe around the issue, he didn't say that he had done nothing wrong. He did try to clear the air a bit, but ultimately his response, especially paired with the acknowledgement that he saw himself as a feminist now and actually supported universal base income, while potentially just another way to save face, were also not the response of a man trying to cultivate the alt-right fanbase that was flocking to his game now. In the same Vice interview, he also mentions that his game is meant to tackle political issues, but not as a one-way critique or to push an agenda, more to explore new benefits and problems that would arise with a new future. At multiple points, he mentions that he actually likes the idea of UBI, but wanted to explore a world that also tackled AI superiority and the loss of jobs as a result, combining those ideas and more to create this world where some people prosper and others feel like they have nothing to work for and achieve. He wants to present the world and then you react to it and come to your own conclusions, and while I feel like it's impossible not to pass your own biases and judgments as a creator, I do follow the logic that he's presenting here, and it may not be as much of a ham-fisted metaphor as it originally seemed. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in this topic to check out this Vice article. It's a little bit long and I don't want to go through it all in this video since I wouldn't be adding much extra context and I don't want to read it all verbatim, that seems scummy, but I think it presents a solid exploration of this whole controversy and the game itself. Ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide if this whole mess is enough to turn you off from the game or not. I certainly won't argue with anyone who says that they want nothing to do with it, but I do think it's not a black and white issue. And while it's been maybe the biggest talking point of the game thus far, and it will undoubtedly continue to be brought up when the game has more public updates again, I do think there's a world out there where the game is able to show a level of nuance that can allow it to escape the black cloud that's following it, providing Tim's comments from 2017 are truly genuine. Raw Fury's stance on the tweets at the time was that they rejected them and they didn't represent the Tim that they knew, also confirming that they would continue to support Odd Tales as they believe the opinions in them were not representative of him today or the game as a whole. But in late 2020, it was announced that Raw Fury and Odd Tales had agreed to part ways 2 years prior in late 2018, about a year and a half after the controversy had blown up. I'm not sure why Raw Fury decided to drop the game then, since the decision was made way after the peak of the issue, but it might have had more to do with finances as the game got more and more expensive to make. Tim's outwardly claimed that if the game sells for about $30, they'll need to sell around 300,000 copies to break even. Obviously, some of that going to whatever platform or retail store that's selling the game, so a rough estimate for the budget here is 10 million, which is ungodly for an indie game, although it does seem likely that it'll hit that sales mark given it's been wishlisted by over 250,000 people already. Regardless of what reasons Raw Fury had for leaving, and it really is just something that we can speculate on, Odd Tales was now fully independent, and as of mid-2022, all it has to show for it is a single teaser trailer. Or does it? In June of 2021, exactly 4 E3s after the last night debuted at Xbox's show floor, we got our first look at a new game once again at the Xbox showcase with a style so similar to the last night, people actually believed it was the same game reborn with a new, kind of meta name, Replaced. To be clear, Replaced is not the rebirth of the last night. These are two different products, they just look really similar. Tim Saray actually acknowledged the similarity on Twitter by saying it was cool that games had been inspired by the last night's art style, but that mentioning your inspirations was a totally cool thing to do. A little passive aggressive maybe, but ultimately there's no ill will here. I've actually made a video about my excitement around Replaced already, and I mentioned in it that people had likened it to The Last Night, a game that had totally disappeared, and then a helpful Sasquatch quoting Frankenstein told me that hold on a second, this game is still alive and kicking. Usually when we think of updates for a game, we think of big trailers and interviews, but instead of taking that route, Odd Tales and Tim Saray specifically have decided to focus on a much tighter fan base. Tim's Twitter is littered with beautiful clips of the game as it continues to make progress, but even more informative is the active Discord, which is filled with devlogs, FAQs, game discussions, and a bunch bunch more. Tim is on here all the time, openly discussing things like the budget, like I mentioned earlier, outlining the ins and outs of different shaders and animation tricks, taking suggestions, and explaining the difficulties involved in not just making a game, but running an independent studio working on new cutting-edge tech. Some of the specific info here is that as of almost 2 years ago, they said that the game was at least 2 years out, so yeah, math checks out there. The team's only planning 2 more trailers and wants them out closer to the game's release. The game is meant to make a comeback this year, with Tim mentioning even just a couple of months ago that there would be something big for 2022. Not a trailer, but more of a dev diary probably, and he also gets into why the game is taking so long to make, mainly that they moved it from being a minimal viable product to the truest form of their vision that was 20 times as expensive and a whole lot harder to make. Scouring through here is interesting just as somebody who's into the game making process. There's a lot of technical terms that I don't get and discussions about animations that go straight over my head, but I gotta admit, quickly scrolling through these discussions every once in a while is cool, and you might find out that there's a lot more bits and pieces on The Last Night, its story, its AI, and its style out there than you may have been led to believe. It kind of feels like this underground ring of people talking about this game with a lot of passion, while it stays a bit more silent in its marketing, and I think the strategy of being so open and thorough with fans will probably pay off really well once the game releases. Lord knows I've criticized doing the exact opposite. When The Last Night will eventually release is still a big question mark, though I'd wager the first half of 2024 based on what I've seen. When it does release, this game undoubtedly has my attention. Like I said, it may come out as glorified propaganda, which would be a real shame, but I hope it's something more. We need more bold artistic expression in this industry. We need more nuanced worlds. As much as people have absolutely destroyed the meaning of this phrase, we need more politics in gaming. Disco Elysium, BioShock, Metal Gear Solid. I want more games that aren't afraid to be bold, as long as they aren't also hateful. Looking at you, 15-year-old edgelord in a video game's body. And I really hope that The Last Night is able to come out of all of this exactly the kind of game that we need more of right now. This thing has the toolset to become a genre-defining title, and even though it's decided on taking a quieter approach these last few years, it might be well worth it to keep your eye on its more silent marketing going forwards. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you're new here, subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.